share my thinking with you about the relationship between globalization and world conflict. If we look at the world around us, it may seem that things are falling apart. There are conflicts in Iraq, Lebanon, tensions between the West and Iran, controversies about North Korea, the collapse of the Doha round, high oil prices, and so on. But maybe it's not productive to focus on the conflict du jour. It's most important to concentrate on what lurks beneath the surface and take a long view. To think about what Fernand Braudel called the long duration. Now, when I talk about globalization, I refer to a syndrome that is not a single process, but a series of processes, a set of interactions. Now, let us contemplate whether globalization promotes more security or insecurity in the world. To do this, I want to begin by picking up on some classical themes. First, there is Immanuel Kant's famous essay, Perpetual Peace, written in 1795. Kant offered a vision of a specific union of republican states. For Kant, these states would not wage war on one another, but there would be agreement to disarm. For Kant, world peace lies in a proper balance of force and morality. There would be a cosmopolitanism, not a replacement of the nation states, but an identification with global citizenry. Today there is a conscious revival that spawns thinking about a future of world peace. We could see this in the argument about a democratic peace. That is, that democratic nations do not go to war with one another. We can see it in some of the empathy that exists around the world. For example, I worked in developing countries during the tsunami, and I witnessed extremely poor people making contributions to relieve the victims of the tsunami, and identification with the whole. A second stream of thinking, I'm going to stop. Is the sound all right? Curtis? I'm hearing a lot of background noise. Is there a problem with the sound?
Yeah, we do seem to be experiencing some problem with the sound. We're trying to correct it. I'm not sure if it's from this end. Can you try now?
We're trying now. Is it better? It sounds better here. Is it better?
Say something. I think it has clear. Okay.
Now?
Yeah, that's better. No?
And am I speaking it about the right pace for everyone?
Your pace is fine. It's just the sound on the background.
All right, we're trying to correct it here.
Okay, that's better now.
All right. Maybe you increase it a bit so I can... Okay, yes. Oh, all right. All right. Okay, yes. Now, a second stream of thinking comes from revisionist historians, especially Charles Beard, who inspired a thesis related to Immanuel Kant's. The thesis is known as Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace. And the idea was that for war makers, there is always an urgent reason to go to war to secure peace. This theme came out in the novels by George Orwell, certainly in my own life, I can remember when President Richard Nixon went on television and said to the American public, we are extending the war from Vietnam to Cambodia. We are going to bomb Cambodia in order to bring peace to Vietnam. In the current era, we might say that there is perpetual competition. With a compression of time and space, that is globalization, capitalists come more directly into contact with other capitalists. Now there is a rise of what the scholar Richard Devaney called hyper-competition. That is a concerted effort by executives in business to increase market instability and the uncertainty of operations, or a type of social Darwinism. Indeed, one sees the ideological effects of this in the United States and certain other countries. In the United States, there is concern about whether the United States is number one or is it losing its number one position in the critical areas of science and technology. And a number of measures are used, such as the number of patents taken out by Americans, the published research in scientific journals by Americans, the number of Nobel Prizes, and so on. Nevertheless, federal research budgets are at an all-time high. So what is the reason? The reason for this is the competitive driving forces. So to summarize, there are these three strands in thinking: perpetual peace, perpetual war for perpetual peace, and thirdly, perpetual competition. Now, my argument is that there are two tendencies that are dominant in world order today. The first one I have referred to briefly, that is hyper-competition in the geo-economy. This is exemplified by cross-border takeovers and cross-border mergers. A second tendency is hyperpower in geopolitics. This term was coined in 1998 by former French Foreign Minister Hubert Védrine to mean a superordinate capacity to prevail in conflicts of interest. So Védrine developed this notion of hyperpuissance or hyperpower. And one can look at certain indicators of this. The United States has the largest national economy in the world. It has unmatched technological prowess according to a number of empirical indicators. And today, its military spending is about 50% of world military spending. Also important is the U.S. lead in information systems and the spread of the American variant of the English language. Surely, there are many weaknesses that the United States has. There are limits to the effectiveness, and this is one of the issues that is being debated in the Pentagon today. But my concern is what happens when hyper-competition in the geo-economy and hyperpower in geopolitics converge. What is the outcome? And this will be my punchline. This will be my conclusion that I want to lead up to. But first, it's important to note rapid conflicts in globalization. And these conflicts all have one thing in common. They are about global governance. That is, the rules of the game. And whose rules of the game shall they be? Let me just mention quickly 4 conflicts in recent history, but one can go back much farther and to look at these conflicts within globalization. 11 years ago, there were negotiations in the OECD in Paris over the multilateral agreement on investment. This treaty, negotiated among 30 developed countries, was far-reaching in scope. Its objectives were to remove barriers to foreign trade and extend capital markets. The treaty was negotiated in secret until an NGO received word about it. It was leaked, it was posted on the internet, and civil society organizations in several countries, beginning with Canada, mobilized against this treaty, and it was defeated in the OECD, although it could resurface again in another organization such as the WTO. Soon thereafter, there was the Asian financial crisis, 1997-1998, which was neither financial nor was it Asian. Rather, the crisis had political dimensions. It immediately rippled to Russia, to Brazil, to South Africa. It became a global crisis. And when Malaysia's former Prime Minister, Mahathir, complained about the currency speculators, he found there was no court of last resort with which to go to take his complaints over global governance. Thirdly, beginning in 1999, there was the Battle of Seattle with criticism of the World Trade Organization, but more generally, it signaled rage over the underside of globalization. Civil society organizations from several countries came together. There was violence in Seattle, and soon this conflict, this rage over the dark side of globalization spread to Genoa, to Gothenburg, to Seoul, to Melbourne, and several cities around the world. Thus today, the metaphor battles of Seattle is used to signify anger against neoliberal globalization. And then on 9/11, there was an attack by a global network against the Pentagon and the World Trade Centers, symbols of American military might and global capitalism. These attacks have drawn attention to the system of values inscribed in the dominant form of globalization. They have drawn attention to military globalization, that is, the attempt to use more and more coercion in order to enforce and to apply the values of neoliberal globalization. If anything, 9/11 signaled a conflict between the state-centered world and a polycentric world, that is, a more decentered world. So, to conclude my remarks, I'd like to suggest that the conflict points are cumulative, they are building, and to use Winston Churchill's felicitous phrase, there is a gathering storm in the world. My thesis, the punchline that I would like to suggest is that hyper-competition plus hyper-power equal hyper-conflict. Again, hyper-competition in geoeconomics, hyper-power in geopolitics, together signal hyper-competition, hyper-conflict, a new form of conflict in the world. Of course, this is not expected, but nor was the Great Crash in 1929, which led to a restructuring of the global economy, world war, and new international institutions. Now, what does hyper-conflict mean? What are its manifestations? One is a pervasive insecurity, an intersubjective insecurity. a greater fear in the world, which we all experience when we go through airports and checkpoints. It signifies changing structures of armed conflict that are not necessarily in the hands of governments or their agents at the world level. Greater instability. Secondly, there can be different scenarios for hyper-conflict with different ratios of hyper-competition and hyper-power, depending on the specific episode and the context. Thirdly, hyper-conflict is not a one-size-fits-all proposition. It will not be the same in everywhere in the world. It will be refracted differently in various regions. But hyper-conflict is a set of systemic drivers. It is the underlying elements that are pushing specific and concrete conflicts in the world. Finally, the fourth characteristic is that whatever the proximate cause that touches off conflict, now it can spread at lightning speed because of the elements of globalization. New technologies, advanced systems of weaponry, a policy framework that lowers barriers, and integrated financial markets. But of course, history is not predetermined. It is not foreordained. Rather, history is open-ended. Ultimately, different world orders are possible. Globalization was made by human beings. It can be remade by human beings. Fresh thinking, not wishful thinking, is required. By wishful thinking, I mean the world of the make-believe. Fresh thinking is concrete analysis, and it must be combined with countervailing power in order to remake globalization and to bring about a peaceful world. Thank you.